I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. What are we looking at today, Rob?
We're looking at a story which in English is called A Tower for the Summer Heat. In Chinese is 下一楼.
下一楼, yeah.
Yeah.
This is written by Li Yu.
Li Yu. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. With Li Yu's, we'll get to Li Yu in a second. He's one of a very interesting figure. The other podcasts we've done on the Huaban genre of writing, which is very literally vernacular literature. The other heavy hitter we've talked about is Feng Menglong, who has written a number of things. We have a podcast up on Jiang Xingge rediscovers his pearl shirt. So if you enjoy this kind of thing, you should check out that one too. This is a fascinating story. I mean, utterly fascinating story.
It's really great.
We'll talk about why it's so great. But let's go ahead and give a quick plot sketch because that way people are a little oriented. So the story concerns essentially two lovers. One whose name is Xian Xian, a woman, and Ziren, a man. Xian Xian is cloistered in her father's compound. Her father is a very dedicated Neo-Confucian who has the women completely sequestered from the men. And in fact, Xian Xian even spends the summer in a tower, sort of locked up. She does it herself, but to stay cool. But anyway, she teaches a lot of the female children in the compound. And one day, while she's taking a nap, they all decide to essentially go skinny dipping in the lake. And she reprimands them when they come out. And then shortly after, a matchmaker or a go-between comes up and says, "Hey, this guy wants to marry you." She says, "I don't see how that's possible. I've never left this compound." He said, "Well, the guy who wants to marry you is kind of like a god, and he knows everything about you." And proceeds to give some very intimate details there's no way anyone could possibly know. Then there's a slight pause, and the reader is told, aha, how does that guy know as much as he does? Well, he has this thing.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, he has this thing called a telescope that was brought in from Western countries by the Jesuits. And essentially, Jiren, this guy, has gotten a hold of a telescope and is hanging out in a monastery, essentially peeping girls around the city to figure out, I want to marry somebody, but I got to know what she looks like and all that first.
Yep.
Anyway, convinced that Jiren is a god, Xian Xian decides to figure out how to marry him, and the story centers on how they hoodwink her father into making sure that they can be married. Because
she doesn't know they're hoodwinking. She thinks he's a god for most.
She thinks he's a god, yes. But she becomes complicit in the plot later, and then finds out about the telescope at the very end, and we're not told very much about her response. She sort of shrugs it off, and is kind of like, well, whatever. And the very last paragraph in the passage, which is, Lee and I disagree a great deal about the purpose of this paragraph, but Jiren, now having married Xian Xian, goes ahead and starts sleeping with all the women in the house because he's already seen them with his telescope bathing in the lake.
And so to have seen them naked is to have already essentially made love to him, so why not just go that next little extra step? And the writer tells us, which was kind of his point all along, the end. So this story is fascinating for a whole lot of reasons, but I think for you and me both, the biggest one is the presence of the telescope. Yeah,
why is that so interesting to you?
I think it's interesting because, so for me being a literary, I don't like to use the word Freudian because I'm not actually a Freudian.
You keep saying that, but every time there's something long, it's something that could be possibly phallic, you're like, aha, phallic symbol.
Well, I mean, let me just defend myself here. This telescope is described in quite phallic terms.
Yes.
The author Li Yu talks about the thickness of it, about one thing going inside the other, and I think in a more general sense, the gaze in this story is what penetrates. It's the thing. It stands in for it's a penetrating device.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's that off to be saying this is sort of a phallic symbol, not in necessarily a Freudian sense, but just in a kind of I think Li Yu was aware that there was a phallic symbolism.
Absolutely. He was definitely using... Li Yu was a very commercial writer.
Mm-hmm.
Li Yu understood that sex sells.
Li Yu always used his name when he wrote these stories and sold them, which was kind of unusual.
Right.
You wouldn't normally have your name... You wouldn't normally have your real name on this kind of literature. It would be a pseudonym.
so that you weren't associated with the smutty literature that you were writing.
Right.
And this is, we should tell the listener, this is a very smutty story in some way.
Yeah. I mean, the main plot arc is a guy using a telescope to see women in their dressing rooms and baths.
And that skinny dipping scene is quite intimate. Like, there's some spanking going on, if I remember correctly.
It's described in such a way that it's very clear that the author is just giving us a little flesh.
It's almost like the author himself is enjoying it.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting because it brings this question, like, are we then complicit in this? Like, as we're reading this, are we ourselves watching the girls kind of skinny dip? And I think that calls into question, like, one of the things I think, so the telescope is not just a phallic symbol. It's a symbol of the reader. It is a kind of, like, super reading device. So overall, this story is asking a question about reading and what we do by reading a story and what relationship we have to that story.
And let's get at something because you mentioned, use the word penetrate.
Yeah.
But that implies, of course, that there is a boundary, a border, something that you are penetrating into. Yeah. And this takes us to one of the main themes throughout Huaban literature.
You could say this is the motif that dominates most Huaban.
Right. Which is...
that we have read and we're qualified experts on.
Yeah, exactly. You've read them all. Everyone knows this. But the concept of inside and outside, or nei and wai.
Right.
Even now, for example, if you say wai guo, it literally means outside of the boundaries of the state.
Wai ren is just stranger, like person outside.
Right.
Nei ren is like family, right?
Something like that, yeah. Nei ku is underwear, for example. So there you go. And the concept is a Neo-Confucian concept, and essentially the way it works is that there is a nei, the inside, which is what you must sort of retain control of in some fashion. So the home has a nei and a wai physically here. You know, there's a
physical divide between the nei and the wai, and the woman is supposed to remain in the nei.
Always inside, because that is her realm. If she proceeds out of that realm, in Huaban literature, terrible things happen.
And we saw that story we saw that kind of thing in Zhang Xingge rediscovers his pearls, I'm sure, right?
Yeah.
Like, the thing that started the story that started the plot moving, is a woman standing near a window.
Dun dun!
So, which is actually apparently quite a common plot device in Huaban literature. A woman standing near a window gets seen, and then a man falls in love with her. And so there's the window is kind of the symbol of sort of interior, but sort of exterior. Semi-nei, semi-wai.
It's embedded in the house walls, so technically it's nei, but it can be open to the outside world.
It can be penetrated. By the gaze.
By the gaze. Now, in this story, one of the reasons we bring up the nei and the wai here is because in most other Huaban stories, this nei and this wai, inside-outside dynamic, usually gets overturned in a physical way. Someone leaves the house. Someone goes into the house. A window is open. Here, the Zhang family, the patriarch, Mr. Zhang, has total control over the household. No one, at least that we read, no one goes in or out that shouldn't be going in or out.
Mm-hmm.
So even the women and the men are kept separate from each other within the same house.
Yep.
Total control. And yet, something is able to get in.
Something penetrates.
Lee is going to keep hitting this verb until
Rob smacks me.
Until I smack.
Which I think is like one or two more uses from now.
Could be. We'll have to keep a tally.
So I think this nei and wai concept is really great. Let's develop it a little bit more.
So let's talk, for example, about the way in which the nei and the wai in this story sort of proceed. Not proceed, but there's a nei and a wai that's within a single household. That's fairly easy to follow in the plot.
But then there's a nei and the wai of the household. The household is the nei itself, and the wai is the outside world. And
there's even a nei and a wai here nationally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which we'll get at as well. Let's start with the house. So everyone is sequestered here. So within the household, what is nei and what is wai?
The women are nay, and the men are Y.
So, and they're not necessarily going even leaving the house, but within the house, there's an inside and there's an outside.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, with this telescope, Jiren is able to penetrate the household nay, the inside, right? Mm-hmm. Without even physically crossing the distance. Now, why would this be...
Again, I think this is like the window, to a certain degree.
It is.
The window is a space in which there's an ambiguous border. It's both inside, but sort of outside. You're able to penetrate it. So the telescope is just like a sort of giant window.
Yeah, and so how is this anxiety-producing? Or how does this sort of draw from a sense of anxiety in the readership?
Well, I mean, one thing we've talked about before is... there are these Jesuits and other Westerners starting to land on China's shores, and they're starting to, even if they're kind of like an oddity or curio themselves, or they're bringing curios and they are oddities themselves, they are starting to change China in very small ways.
Yes, they are. They're getting at, for example, the Jesuit scholars and translators who really the first official Jesuit mission where they're actually really interacting with the court is mid-16th century with St. Francis Xavier. Yeah. And after that, of course, we have someone like Matteo Ricci, who's extremely famous. For those who don't know Ricci, he was an absolute master of Chinese. And
Jonathan Spence wrote an amazing book on him.
The Memory Palace, Matteo Ricci. Ricci spoke incredible Chinese, translated Euclid's Elements into Chinese. And
he's a Confucian scholar.
Yeah, so. A lot of the Jesuit translators and missionaries worked mostly in science and mathematics.
Mm-hmm. Because that was, at that point, I mean, if you think about it, we're talking mid-1600s.
Right.
So the West really does have...
Mid-16th century to the mid-1600s.
Well, I mean, Li Yu is writing in the mid-1600s. Sorry. The West really is starting to have a real advantage over the rest of the world in terms of science and technology at this point. We're talking, I mean, Galileo, all of these kind of late Renaissance, early Enlightenment figures are kind of bubbling up.
Yeah.
And the telescope is just one example. Right. But I actually wanted to talk about the ads.
Let's get to the ads in just a second. I wanted to make a quick point, one last quick point about the Jesuits, which is that this is a really interesting example of national nay and why, because there's nothing more nay inside than the emperor and his court. Mm-hmm. This is why you see something like the Forbidden City, for example, where the king simply...
It's the ultimate nay.
It's the ultimate nay. No one is allowed in.
Unless they're eunuchs, which at that point, they almost become this kind of ambiguous nay, because, I mean, they literally have their testicles chopped off.
Right.
And so they can't penetrate in a very physical way, but also in a sort of ideological way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and what's important to remember with that, too, is that even now, the closer you are to Beijing, the closer you are to the center of power.
Right.
Beijing is where things happen. It's where things have happened for a long time. Now, that wasn't necessarily the case back then, but...
It was, I think.
But what I was going to say was wherever the emperor's court was, that was ultimate nay. And here, you have people who are clearly not of the ruling class... of the Manchu at this point, they are able to have access to this nay, even though they themselves did not go through any of the channels you're supposed to go through to get there. But by virtue of the knowledge of technology and science they bring, they get to sort of leapfrog this, which is a little unsettling. It would be like someone never going to school in our country, and all of a sudden they become a CEO of a corporation or the president of the United States. We think, wait a second, how did this happen?
That's a very educationally oriented bias you're showing, Ron. Because
I know, right?
lots of people don't go to school and still become amazing heads of companies. But yeah, I don't know. For me, so I don't actually read this as much. I'm hesitant to read this as Manchu so much. The more I think about it, I see your point, but I also kind of think that Li Yu is really talking about Westerners and the Jesuits. I think he's talking about, I think the message of the story, or one of the messages of the story is like, hey, these Jesuits, they have cool technology, but watch out. They might get into the ultimate nay of your household, which is, again, your women, and penetrate them with their technology and we need to think about how this is working. And I think he's drawing on that sort of anxiety. I'm not saying that the Manchu thing is not valid, but the more, I don't know, it feels like it's directed at Westerners. Maybe that's because I've got 4 centuries more than Liu does.
I don't know. I don't know that I could go along and read it as look out for the Westerners themselves.
He does, in the story, he does make very clear that it's Western technology. He uses the word 西方 and 中国 to contrast it.
The reason this would be tricky for me to accept, though, is that at this point, the Jesuits themselves are still fairly limited with where they're going and can go. It's not like they can wander the provinces at will and walk into people's homes. Now, their technology is a little different. Because this is a commodity. This can be something that you give in exchange. It has sort of free range, right? And so this is what I see really happening in the story, because every generation, even in European and American cultures, has its terrifying new technology story, you know? Well, now there's the internet. What if all of your secrets could just be stolen, put out there, and everyone, you know, things like this. Mm-hmm. There's always that sort of horror story that's all the more horrifying because there's an element of truth.
Suddenly the boundaries that you had established and felt were almost natural are now violatable.
Right. They're not penetrated. Go ahead and say it.
They're penetratable. We are actually, if the listener is listening to this, you should do a drinking game every time I say the word penetrate.
Although, make sure it's a very low-proof alcohol, because that could be dangerous.
Yeah.
Safety first.
Corn whiskey. The listener loves corn whiskey.
They all do. Everyone listening to our podcast is drinking corn liquor.
Goodness. All right, back to the story. Back to Chinese literature.
Which is what we're here for. So, the telescope for me is a very interesting commodity. And this is you do see this in a lot of Huaban. A commodity is what enables the story to function. In Zhang Xingge's Pearl Shirt, for example, it's
Pearl
Shirt.
Right. And pearls come up again and again in that story in very interesting ways. Can we talk a little bit more about that advertising part?
Sure. So just to set it up real quick, though, there's a section in the story when the narrator is introducing the fact that Jiren has a telescope. And he says, wow, we got this technology from the Westerners, from the Jesuits. And then there's a weird trio of little informational bits that read exactly like advertisements.
Yeah, it's a strange thing. So we get the setup of the story, and the kind of like skinny dipping thing happens in chapter 1. And then right at the end of chapter 1, we learn that this proposal has occurred.
Yes.
And so chapter 2 actually begins with explaining, Jiren, he has this telescope thing. It's really sweet. You know, and then it goes actually into ads for different kinds of looking technology.
Or read as ads.
Right. It reads as almost an advertisement. Yeah. And it's only looking technology. What do we have? There's a microscope. There's a device for taking the sun's rays and setting on fire.
Like a magnifying glass.
A magnifying mirror.
Yeah.
What else? I think that's it.
There's like a hand mirror.
Yeah, a hand mirror too. That's right.
And then there's this, what they call a 1,000 Li mirror or glass, which is a telescope.
Glass, yeah. And it's just this really incredibly strange passage. I found it fascinating. Just because it comes in the middle of the story, and it's like nothing I've ever read before in Chinese literature.
Expound. Why is it so strange, though?
Because it's using the language of advertising. It's almost like he's trying to convince us that we should be buying this. And I guess that plays into the story to a certain degree, because one of the things I think that drives this story is, even though Jiren is doing something bad, he's violating the Nei-Wai boundary, we still have sympathy for him, because he's really smart. And I think Liu, the author, likes Jiren because he's really clever. And like that cleverness drives it. So this almost seems to be playing into that sense of like, oh, this is a really clever contraption. Because as soon as we learn about the telescope, I mean, think about that early Qing reader who's getting this and seeing that kind of erotic, pornographic scene with the skinny dipping and going like, oh, how is this even relevant? And then all of a sudden you hear, you're able to see it. You're able to get in top of a tower in a monastery and be and grab a telescope and go watch young girls skinny dipping. Like it's almost, the advertisement itself is almost as pornographic as the skinny dipping.
It's reminding you that with this sort of focus on it being an actual commodity, which is the way an advertisement would read, you too can have this thing. It's making clear that what he's doing is not something that you have to be an expert with incredible training to do.
Or, I think more relevant for Chinese literature generally is, you don't have to be a god either.
No, you don't have to be anything. Like, anyone can use a telescope.
Yeah.
This is technology that anyone can use to get through the nay and the why. Right. I'm not saying penetrate. I'm not doing it.
You just did.
I know, but I had to make a point. Anyway. So there's a sense at which he's sort of giving the reader a little wink here. Like, oh, yes, by the way, this magic thing, no, there's other things like this, and they're all out there. Yeah. You know, right before this, when he's introduced, actually, it's just right after this, he's mentioning where Jiren got it. And essentially, Jiren and his friends stumble into a shop one day, and the guy's like, hey, check this out.
Yeah.
Jiren takes it and does not say to himself, you know, with this, I could observe the heavens, I could chart astronomy. He goes, I think I have some other ideas for this thing.
Do you think that's
both hilarious and frightening?
Do you think that's the narrator here criticizing Jiren? Or is it saying, oh, yeah, that's really
I think given Liu's commercial interests in sort of selling his literature, making cash, I think he knows exactly what he's doing. This is one of those cases where I'm trying to think of a comparable story where someone has a powerful artifact and uses it entirely to get what they want. We have a lot of stories like this in the Europe and the U.S.
Can I ask you?
What?
Do you think Liu is seeing himself as Jiren?
I don't know. It's because that for me is a little tricky because I don't know how you would evaluate his personal identification with a character. But there is definitely a sense, and it is very pornographic, that the reader's focus is on these sensual details that are, viewable through this telescope.
Right. I don't know. I was just kind of trying to conceptualize the telescope as a sort of pin.
That's a little. That would be a little bit.
I think there's a bit of stretch.
A little bit of stretch for me. But what I really wanted to get across with this is that this story is written at a time when a lot of traditional ideas about nay and why, about how society is supposed to be organized, are starting to phase out.
And let's discuss those, because you discussed the nay and why of the Manchurians. These Manchurians who are not quote unquote Chinese are suddenly at the nayest of nays.
They're the ones ruling. They're like the early Qing.
They're the emperors. They have access to in a very sexual way, and I want to highlight that sexuality because I think that's definitely playing into the anxiety. The emperor has this harem essentially, and so he is able to. This guy who's supposed to be on the outside is able to penetrate into the inside of, into Chinese women. I'm not trying to be funny or whatever, but I think that anxiety is definitely something going on in the story. But other kinds of blurrings of the nay-why line, boundary lines, this is at the time when sort of early Chinese capitalism, if we could call it that, is really getting off the ground. You have lots of people, particularly from Fujian, who are traveling to Taiwan, who are traveling to Southeast Asia. A
lot more non-Chinese merchants showing up in ports.
And they're, like the whole idea of a lot of these stories, we've talked about this before, is containment. Mm-hmm. Perfect containment is this Neo-Confucian ideal. Nothing goes in, nothing inside goes out, and nothing outside goes in. But in a very capitalistic kind of way, things are being moved around in this incredible, like the amount of movement compared to previous periods is incredible. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is also a concern and a concern that this story has, and a blurring of the boundaries of nay and why.
I would agree. I think that's...
I think maybe less so than something like the pearl-sewn shirt.
Right.
But...
Well, for example, here you have if you want to think of it, a kind of acceleration of what's possible with the things that are coming in from the outside. The pearl-sewn shirt, for example, in that story, it's a commodity that allows these relationships in the story to happen, but it's something made. It's a family heirloom.
Right.
A telescope is presented to us as a piece of technology coming from the West.
Almost
and
magical.
it's almost magical, but it's also...
It is actually presented as magical.
But it's also easily accessible, and it's something anyone can use, which this is where it begins to get tricky for Chinese markets, for Chinese people, because you have these things coming in from the outside that people who are not Chinese have made, and yet are beginning to be extremely important to the people in power. Mm-hmm. And how do you know how these things are used? Well, the answer is you don't really know. Now, I think what I like about the story, what for me makes it most effective, is what I see is the humor involved in it. Because...
And it's a pretty funny story.
It is. Well, it's drawing off of the anxiety over some of these commodities, but at the same time, it's undeniably funny to consider this incredible, powerful new piece of technology, and this guy's using it to check out girls. Yeah. Like that's in the context of the story, that's very, very funny because it's both anxiety-producing and also kind of funny at the same time, which sort of... This is why Li Yu is so interesting, is he's able to do both things. Create anxiety and then lessen at the same time by making people laugh.
Mark Twain, I think, said it best when he said, sadness is the root of all humor.
Yeah. And here it would be anxiety is the root of all humor, too. So, but, this...
Laughter is both for nervousness and for...
Yeah, exactly. But what would be, for me, important about the story to remember as sort of... Because this isn't my research field. I do mostly modern Chinese stuff from, say, late Qing on. Mm-hmm. There is still very much a concern over nay and why, even in modern China.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of the tension in modern Chinese culture is over this nay, this we Chinese have this thing. We have this old culture, ancient, very beautiful culture, and yet for 200 or so years, we've been, on the receiving end of a lot of these powerful countries. Mm. Why? Why does the why now dominate the nay? Like, why do we have all these foreign goods flooding our markets? And, of course, those boundaries are very fuzzy because the Chinese also flood other markets. But there's a desire to contain what is supposed to be inside.
And I think you could see maybe some parts of Maoism as kind of this ultra-nay movement. Mm-hmm. The entirely dependent on China, the economy being entirely dependent on China and not having any trade with any outsiders. That element of Maoism, I think you can see some elements of that nay and why.
We're going to do everything ourselves.
Yeah.
And there is still a desire for that nowadays. I mean...
Though I think that is necessary. That's not necessarily just a Chinese thing.
No, it's not. But I think that explains for me a lot of tension over, for example, what happens in some outlying territories in China. As a U.S. citizen, if, for example, Hawaii wanted to break away and be its own country, I would think, fine, it doesn't really bother me that much. Or even if it did bother me, I wouldn't, under no circumstances would I ever be willing to get involved in military action.
Right.
But that is the case in China with Taiwan, with Tibet, with Xinjiang. When I was living there, I was always befuddled. Why is this such a big deal? That was one of the few things that everyone I met agreed on. Even if they didn't all agree they wanted to go to war, they were all like, oh yeah, Taiwan's ours. Like, under no circumstances should this be allowed to stand. I remember thinking, why the vehemence? I don't really get it on behalf of everybody. But I think it draws from some of the same values and culture that's driving this story, which is that if you lost control of your nay, if you can no longer contain what you believe to be a part of your home, if you lose control of that, you've lost everything.
Do you have anything else you want to say?
I'm good.
I was thinking of one more thing.
Go for it.
Penetrate.
I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore. And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.